Welcome to this online lesson asking the question, why did Henry VIII carry out the dissolution of the monasteries? Our aim today is to know the consequences of the Act of Supremacy and Henry VIII's break from the Catholic Church. This is a huge turning point in the history of England, and so it's really important that we understand the reasons behind it. In future lessons, we're going to be having a look at a lot of the consequences of this, so it really is a big event. Firstly, let's consider what changed. This is Byland Abbey in North Yorkshire as it looked in around the year 1530, early in Henry's reign. It had a wonderful church and many other buildings, including libraries, kitchens and even a hospital. It was called one of the shining lights of the north by some. This is how it looks today. Little remains now, as most of it was destroyed after it was closed or dissolved in 1538. So what on earth happened in those 8 years between its heyday and its complete destruction? Incidentally, you can visit many abbeys like this across England. It's not just something that happened to Byland Abbey. It happened to virtually every monastery in the whole of the country. If you're unfamiliar with what a monastery is, or rather was in this country, then later on we're going to be having a look at that. But first, let's have a look at what Henry did during his reign, which resulted in this change. If you wanted to have a closer look at what the monastery looked like, here it is. You can see in the top left, that is the main church building, and then the squares are known as cloisters, and these connect together the other buildings, with the long building at the bottom left being the dormitory where the monks slept, the chapter house being somewhere in the centre, and the infirmary, being a place where people with disease might be, is off to the side. That's off to the right there, the separate building. You can still sort of make out the outlines of these buildings today. Note this down as a subheading. Key event, the Act of Supremacy, 1534. Pause the video if you want to do that now. A bit of background for you. Earlier in his life, Henry had been a very devout Catholic Christian. He had been awarded the title Defender of the Faith by Pope Leo X after he wrote an article accusing Martin Luther of heresy, questioning the Church's teachings. Heresy was considered a very serious crime at this time, and so this was Henry showing just what a devout Christian he was, or rather, what a devout Catholic Christian he was. Well, what about Martin Luther? No, not Martin Luther King, the famous 1960s American civil rights leader. Although, it's likely as a Christian man, Martin Luther King probably was named after this chap. This Martin Luther, he was a German monk. Martin Luther was an early Protestant. As the name suggests, the Protestant Church is a protest against the teachings of the Catholic Church. Protestants believed people should be able to read the Bible in their own language. Christians can pray to God without the help of a priest, and the Pope was not God's representative on earth. Okay, before we go any further, this is a massive simplification of what Protestantism is. It's just a very brief introduction to give you the idea. Indeed, the divisions between the Protestant and Catholic Church remain very severe to this day in certain parts of the world, and so it's not the sort of thing that you play around with. People can become very offended if you disrespect the teachings on either side, so it's something that needs to be treated with a little bit of care. But you might consider that in the 1500s, or slightly before, is kind of where these ideas start. First of all then, note down why was Henry given the title Defender of the Faith by the Pope? And then secondly, summarise some of the main Protestant beliefs that we've seen here. We're going to have a look at some more in subsequent parts of this lesson. Pause the video while you complete this, about 5 minutes should be long enough. Alright, let's move on. So what did Henry actually do? When Henry wanted to divorce Catherine of Aragon, his first wife, he needed the Pope's permission, but the Pope would not give this. From the Pope's point of view, there were very good reasons for this. The Pope had already given special permission for Henry to marry Catherine. After all, Catherine had originally been married to Henry's brother, and this was considered a sin. Not only that, Catherine was incredibly well connected with other Catholic kingdoms, particularly Spain. And the Pope was worried about upsetting other Catholic kingdoms in England. He didn't want to just make an exception for one kingdom at the expense of lots of others. If we know anything about Henry though, he wasn't going to take this without a fight. Henry took matters into his own hands. He passed the Act of Supremacy, or rather he got Parliament to pass it for him. It declared, among other things, that Henry was now the head of the Church of England. Now that's an important distinction. The Church of England, as we understand it today, didn't exist before this point. Previously, the Pope had been in charge of the Church in England, so the Pope was no longer the head of the Catholic Church in England. Henry had effectively got rid of the Catholic Church. And as a result, England had made a move towards being Protestant. This was known as the break from Rome, because the Catholic Church and the Pope was based in Rome. Alright, quite a lot to take in there, but it's really important stuff. Some tasks then. First of all, why did Henry break from Rome? Think about the importance of his divorce, and you can actually link this to your knowledge of Henry's wives if you've already done that lesson. Secondly, summarise what the Act of Supremacy declared. And thirdly, what new powers might this give Henry? Treat that as an extension, because think about the importance of being in charge of religion within the country at that time. About 10 minutes necessary to do those answers in full sentences, so pause the video now. So Henry is now the head of the Church of England. Good for him. Henry probably didn't change his Christian beliefs that much when he broke from Rome, so it could be argued that he wasn't really a Protestant. However, the Act of Supremacy did bring significant change. Here's what Catholics believed. They believed that the Pope was in charge of the Church. They believed that you could only get to heaven with the priest's help. Praying by yourself wouldn't do it. They believed that services and the Bible should be in Latin. And they also believed that only the Pope could give Henry a divorce. These are all very important points, but again, are just scratching the surface of what Catholic beliefs are. On the other hand, Protestants and Henry believed this. Henry believed that the king was in charge. They believed that you could get to heaven just by believing in God and praying yourself. You didn't need the priest to help you. They believed that services and the Bible should be in English. Now, this is quite an important point because it seems so obvious to us, but previously Catholic church services had been done in Latin and the Bible had been written in Latin. Even many priests weren't able to read it. So the idea of having the Bible written in English was incredibly revolutionary. It had been tried around 100 years earlier and resulted in a rebellion and lots of executions. And lastly, Henry believed that he could give himself permission to divorce Catherine of Aragon. Firstly then, explain how Henry's new beliefs were different from the Catholic beliefs. You can do this in a series of sentences. And secondly, what might be the reaction to other Christians in England? Would they like this? Would they not like this? Well, whatever you think, explain. While you're answering those questions, you can pause the video now. Clearly, these changes give Henry a lot more religious power within the country, and given the central importance of religion in people's lives at this time, that gave him quite a lot more power overall. So what might be the reaction of Christians in England? Well, many people believe that the king was appointed by God, so they might have gone along with it and thought, well, the king wouldn't be making these decisions unless God was guiding him to. However, an awful lot of people would not have liked to have given up their hundreds of years of Catholic traditions and beliefs. Some would actually die for these beliefs. To finish off on this key event then. Now that Henry had made himself the supreme head of the Church of England, he could grant himself a divorce and marry Anne Boleyn. This was a key step towards England becoming a Protestant country, and this was a big reform or change, starting what we know as the religious English Reformation. Some final summary tasks for this incredibly important act then. Write down how the Act of Supremacy made Henry more powerful, and do you think that Henry's beliefs really changed, or did he just want to give himself more power and a divorce? Bear in mind on that extension question, historians are still arguing over this, so you can't really get it wrong as long as you think about it and you explain it as well as you can. Pause the video while you complete these tasks. Let's move on to one of the key effects of the break from Rome. What was a monastery? Monasteries, abbeys and priories and convents were places where monks and nuns lived, worked and worshipped. These were people who devoted their entire lives to the worship of God. They were very rich and usually owned lots of land and many farms called granges. Most monasteries existed to praise God and to help the poor, sick, and help pilgrims on their religious journeys. The word dissolution means to close down or entirely get rid of something. Think of dissolving sugar in water. It seems to disappear, doesn't it? Your task then, write down your own definitions for monastery and dissolution, and that will give you a clue as to what we mean by the phrase dissolution of the monasteries. It should only take you a couple of minutes to do that, so pause the video now. Okay, let's have a look at some other details of what the monasteries involved. What went on in a monastery? Monks said prayers for the dead. It was believed that this would help get the soul to heaven. They studied the Bible. They gave charity to the poor. They provided healthcare for the sick. They grew crops and kept animals. They also provided some limited education, but really only for other monks. And they collected saints' relics, bones, etc. for pilgrims. Now, it should also be pointed out that monasteries could at times be corrupt. They were supposed to be places of holy poverty, but many of them had become incredibly wealthy and powerful. Also, there have been some suggestions that some were making money off the back of pilgrims by inviting them to the monastery to see inauthentic relics, so they might lie too. So it's a bit of a tricky one, this. Some monasteries were very holy and very well behaved, others less so. You can probably imagine which ones Henry was more interested in though. First of all though, which of these activities helped other people? Note those down. Do you think that all monasteries were the same? And do you think that all tried to help people? Pause the video while you complete those follow-up tasks. It shouldn't take you too long. So let's have a look what Henry did with them. Why close the monasteries? Well, Henry ultimately decided that the best course of action for him would be to close the monasteries, but for a variety of reasons. Henry had some problems in his reign, and now the Act of Supremacy gave him the power to deal with them. Your task here is to match the problems to the solutions. Let's have a look at what Henry's problems were first. You might want to note down headings like this as you write this. Henry had to pay for a war in France and his own expensive lifestyle. He needed more money. Some monasteries were very rich, but the monks behaved badly. Henry kind of wanted to punish them. Some monasteries were quite poor and didn't provide much money for Henry, and so they weren't very useful to him. Henry needed to keep his friends and noblemen happy. And some monasteries still wanted to follow the Pope and the Catholic Church. Henry needed to show them who was boss. So what solutions did he come up with? Henry could sell off monastery land to his friends cheaply, making them like him. Henry could take money from monasteries for himself. Henry could send inspectors to the monasteries. Then the badly behaved ones could be shut. Henry could use inspectors to shut down the monasteries that continued to follow the Pope. And Henry could force all poor monasteries worth less than £200 to close and give their land to him. Okay, so write down the problem first and then write down the matching solution next to it. If you're not sure how that will look, then just wait one moment, I'll give you one example as a helper. If not, pause the video now and complete the task. Okay, if you need a bit of a hand, let's have a look at the first problem. Henry had to pay for a war in France and his own expensive lifestyle. He needed more money. That would match up with Henry could take money from the monasteries for himself. Okay, we'll have a look at the other answers in a moment, but pause the video while you complete the task now. Let's have a look at the other answers. Some monasteries were very rich, but the monks behaved badly. Henry could send inspectors to monasteries, then the badly behaved ones could be shut. Some monasteries were quite poor and didn't provide much money for him. So Henry could force all the poor monasteries worth less than £200 to close and give their land to him. That leads into the next one quite nicely. Henry needed to keep his friends and noblemen happy. Henry could sell off monastery land to his friends cheaply, or even give it away, making them like him. And some monasteries still wanted to follow the Pope and the Catholic Church. Henry needed to show them who was boss. Henry could use inspectors to shut down monasteries that continued to follow the Pope. Some abbots were even beheaded for continuing to follow the Pope. There was even a rebellion by people who supported the monasteries, known as the Pilgrimage of Grace, but we haven't got time to have a look at now. This gives us an idea of what Henry did to try and solve his problems though, and how closing the monasteries was helpful to him. So let's have a look at how Henry did it. This was a massive change, and it's incredible that Henry managed to achieve it so quickly. But the point is, he didn't do it on his own. Quite simply, he did all of those things that you've just seen as his solutions. The man he put in charge of closing or dissolving all the monasteries was Sir Thomas Cromwell. You can see him in the picture there. Cromwell was a Protestant and was especially keen to end the Catholic worship that remained in England. As a quick question then, just note down Thomas Cromwell's name and briefly describe who he was. Pause the video while you do this. So why close them? Monasteries worth less than £200 a year, and those that did not help their communities and those that had misbehaving monks, nuns and abbots could all be in trouble. Worst of all, though, were those monasteries that refused to recognise Henry as leader of the church and who continued to follow the rule of the Pope. Let's just imagine that you are one of Cromwell's commissioners and you've been given the task to visit various monasteries and explain why they should be shut down. You're about to see some reports on several real monasteries from Henry VIII's time. The details contained in them are accurate to the records that survive. Your job is to close them all. I want to emphasise that. Your job is not to decide whether or not it should be closed. You are looking for excuses to close all of them. You have to read the text and explain why each one should be closed. Your main excuses to close a monastery are if it earns less than £200 a year, if the monks or nuns are misbehaving or lying, if the monastery are still following the Pope's rule, and if the monastery are refusing to accept Henry as head of the church. Those excuses will be on the screen while we have a look at each monastery. Let's have a look at the first one. Monastery number 1, Bury St Edmund's Convent. Bury St Edmund's Convent was a community of nuns. They generally kept to the rules of their order, like following the daily round of prayers and services, keeping the vows of poverty and chastity, and doing good works for the community. The convent was quite large, but the nuns were not sure how much it earned. However, the nuns did like their relics, something which Henry wanted to destroy. Henry had already destroyed Becket's shrine in Canterbury Cathedral and cast the saints' bones upon a dung heap. They had the relics of dozens of saints in their convent. Not all of them seemed that authentic. You could use a writing frame like this to justify the best reason or reasons why this convent should be closed. Remember, you're taking the part of one of Henry's commissioners here. You are looking for reasons to close this monastery, not keep it open. So pause the video now while you write down the reasons and explain your reasons why Bury St Edmund's Convent should be closed. Well, there are various reasons you could have gone for here. It couldn't prove that it earned more than £200 a year, and that would have been a problem. But probably the biggest one is their obsession with all these relics. That went against Henry's new teachings and followed the old Catholic ways, and that probably would be enough reason for Henry to close it. Monastery number 2. Yes, we're heading just across the road. Bury St Edmund's Monastery. Like the nuns, the monks generally did good works for the local community. The monastery was quite large, but they were not sure how much it earned. However, the abbot did not like to sleep in the dormitory with the other monks, but had his own private room in town. This went against the rule of St Benedict, which said that monks must live together. The abbot also spent a lot on building work. He loved beautiful buildings. He also rented out land and property belonging to the abbey and to the poor people of the town. However, he charged huge amounts of money for the privilege. Worst of all, the abbot did not recognise Henry as the head of the church, and still looked up to the Pope as his spiritual leader on earth. Again, you can use the writing frame to help you here if you need to, but find an excuse to close Bury St Edmund's Monastery. Pause the video while you do so. Well, there's a couple of points here. Firstly, it's clear that the abbot is behaving improperly, but Henry would have recognised another particular advantage here. That rent that was being charged to all those people, it's unlikely they would reduce that, but instead Henry would prefer that that money goes straight to him or to one of his friends. And so that would probably be enough reason to close it down. Monastery number 3, Crossed Friars Monastery, London. This was a small monastery or friary in London. They too did lots of kind things to help the community. They did a lot of work for pilgrims on their way to Canterbury or for the poor of the city. The friary was quite small, but they were not sure how much it earned because they gave back so much of their money to the poor. They probably earned less than £200 per year. However, the abbot did not lead such a pure and holy life. He had many lady friends. and he'd even been caught naked in bed with a woman at 11 o'clock in the morning. Uh-oh. The other friars did all they could to keep chaste and holy lives, and they led exemplary lifestyles. It was only the abbot that was bad. Okay, find an excuse to close this monastery, and pause the video while you do so. Well, hopefully we've identified that this monastery was too poor to stay open. But also, the misbehaviour of the abbot would probably be enough to close the place as well. Monastery number 4, St Michael's Mount Monastery. This is in Cornwall. This was a monastery in Cornwall. Although the monks generally kept to the rules of their order, i.e. they followed the daily round of prayers and services, their record was not entirely spotless. The monastery was quite large and wealthy. They certainly earned more than £200 a year. However, the monks had failed to take notice of Henry's new law making him head of the Church of England, and to ignore the words of the Pope. They should have crossed out all mention of the Pope from their books, but still his name remained in many of them. The monks lived it up sometimes in the monastery, away from the public's gaze, and had been heard playing bowls in the cloisters and drinking. Some even came to the morning service drunk. Okay, find your excuses for closing down this monastery and note them down. Pause the video while you do so. Well, you can't get them on being too poor here, but possibly on misbehaviour. But the bit that Henry would probably take greatest exception to was their refusal to follow all of his rules about getting rid of the Pope's influence. That could be treason and might even result in death. Monastery number 5, our final one, Woolsthorpe Monastery, Lincolnshire. The monks of Woolsthorpe Monastery in Lincolnshire kept to the rules of their order, i.e. they followed the daily round of prayers and services and did charitable works for the local community, for example using the monastic garden to grow herbs and make medicines and cures for the sick. The monastery was quite small. It certainly earned less than £200 per year. The abbot was well loved by the local community. There were 8 monks living there in the monastery, and all of them led blameless and holy lives. They had even tried hard to follow all of the new rules and regulations relating to Henry's new Act of Supremacy, making him the head of the Church of England, by crossing out the Pope's name in all of their prayer books. Surely Woolsthorpe Monastery is completely blameless, but can you close it? Explain how now, and pause the video while you do so. You've probably spotted it by now. It's too poor to carry on. It didn't provide Henry with enough money. I included Woolsthorpe for one reason in particular. It showed that even the most blameless monastery was not immune from Henry's closures. Finally, what happened in the end? Well, this is a massive topic that's got lots of long-term and short-term outcomes. The Act of Supremacy had many important consequences and outcomes, including Henry got his divorce from Catherine of Aragon and married Anne Boleyn. England broke away from the Catholic Church, beginning the Protestant Reformation. The English king became the head of the Church of England, and the monasteries which had existed for hundreds of years were closed. Lastly, the land and wealth of the monasteries was shared with Henry's friends, and they fell into ruin. So, your final finishing up tasks. Firstly, record these outcomes in order of importance. I usually go from most to least important. Secondly, explain your choice for the most important outcome. And lastly, as an extension, which of these outcomes are long-term, with long-lasting effects? Are these more important as a result? While you finish those activities, you can pause the video. But once you're done, that will be the end of the lesson. And I'll thank you very much for watching. I hope it's been interesting and useful to you. And if it has, give the video a like and subscribe to the channel. Thanks very much, and goodbye.